introducing Congressman Paul to you this afternoon, but before I do that, my name is Adam D'Angeli. I'm the Michigan coordinator for this campaign. I do have some important announcements. We have an election tomorrow you may know about. We actually win this thing, and that means making sure that we leave no voter behind, and that every Ron Paul supporter in Michigan turns out tomorrow on Election Day. So there's some important things you need to know about this. Number one, you've probably heard a lot about delegates, and when you hear in these other states where they have these straw votes that mean nothing, Ron Paul has to remind everybody that in those cases, the delegates are what actually matter in those states. If you count those, we're actually in second place, and the media is not always accurate about that. But in Michigan, we do have a primary, and the winners of that primary in each district are, the delegates are going to be bound by the results of that. So we actually have to win this primary tomorrow, guys, in as many districts as we can. And that means turning out the vote. Another thing that you may have heard is that Michigan's a closed primary. That's certainly how it was announced when the Republicans decided upon it. But guess what? That was not true. It's an open primary. And if you are registered to vote in Michigan, no matter what, you can vote in the primary tomorrow. Every Ron Paul supporter in Michigan knows about that, and while you're at it, there's also a good opportunity to make sure that anybody who has any second thoughts about Ron Paul is cleared up on that. And here's what you need to do. Here's what every Ron Paul supporter in Michigan needs to do as soon as they go home today. Step one, make a complete list of everybody in Michigan you know. It's funny, but it is true, and notice I did not say everybody you're friends with at this moment. I mean everybody you know, people you went to high school with, people you work with now, and people you used to work with, people you go to church with, people you're in the service with, everybody. Everybody, no matter what their political affiliation is, you make a list with every name on it. And step two is to call them on the phone. And the call goes something like this. It depends upon how much you know about the political sensibilities of the people that you're talking to. But usually it goes something like this. Hey, Joe, it's Adam. Remember me? Right. Well, hey, I just want to make sure I know that you still live in Michigan, and we have an election coming up tomorrow. And I just want to make sure there's three choices on the ballot. Well, there's actually four, but only three that are significant. Which is counterfeit conservative Mitt Romney, counterfeit conservative Rick Santorum, or maybe are you going to vote for the champion of the Constitution, the man who's going to shatter Barack Obama's base and reclaim the White House for liberty, Ron Paul. Over Barack Obama, whereas Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum were down 10 to 7, actually 7 to 10 respectively. So yes, actually that is the fact. Ron Paul is the electable one in the field right now. But depending on what they say, then there's a few different scenarios you have to consider. Number one, if they say that yes, they support Ron Paul and they're ready to vote for him, you need to make sure that they know that they can vote in the primary. And you'll be amazed how many people are confused about that process. I'm not kidding, guys. Call up every Ron Paul supporter you know in Michigan and make sure that they know that they can vote. And I know you see a lot of young people in this audience. You guys are pretty tech savvy, is that right? Because, anytime people ask me, why Ron Paul has so much support among young people, I say, well, principally because, we're on the internet more. We therefore have, we're not bottlenecked by the mass media there. So, so you're in front of your computer when you're calling your friends. Go to michigan.gov/vote. And all you need is the name, birth month, and I think zip code. And you can actually look up and see whether your friend is registered, and if so, where and exactly where their polling place is. And you can tell them exactly where they go to vote. You can tell them it's 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. tomorrow. Make sure you bring your ID. You don't necessarily need it, but it's always smart to keep it with you. And you make sure that they get to the polls tomorrow on Election Day and cast their ballot for Ron Paul. Now, if they say that they're not sure who they're voting for, there's something that you must do. And for Ron Paul supporters, this can be a little tricky sometimes. You must show them how Ron Paul is their candidate on the issues that matter to them, whatever they are. And I know our issues are all the Constitution, the Federal Reserve, the foreign policy, but talk to them, see what their issue is, and show them how Ron Paul is their candidate on their terms. Because you know what? There's a lot of misinformation out there and even disinformation about what Ron Paul's positions are. So You know, if their issue is abortion, you need to make sure they realize Ron Paul is the pro-life candidate in the race. That's a very important thing because they don't necessarily know that. And no matter what their issue is, I guarantee you, if they are serious constitutional conservatives, Ron Paul is their guy, and they just need to know it if they don't know it quite yet. Number two, in case any of them might actually be, caught up in this nonsense about, whether it's going to be Mitt Romney or Rick Santorum, whether or not that's important for Michigan, you might point out that neither one of them, there's not a dime's worth of difference between them, and neither one of them is kind of going to beat Barack Obama, so if they actually want to do that, they're going to have to vote for Ron Paul tomorrow. And if you know of any Democrats who say they want to vote for Santorum just for the sake of political mischief, remind them, please, that a vote for Rick Santorum is a vote for Rick Santorum. And be careful what you wish for, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, now, in all seriousness, I want to introduce our next speaker tonight. He's going to introduce Dr. Paul. And this is our fourth event in Michigan of 5. The closing act is going to be tonight in Dearborn. But at each of these events, we've had kind of a theme going here. So 2 days ago at Central Michigan University, we had soldiers, airmen, and sailors for Ron Paul, reminding Michigan that Ron Paul is the candidate that our troops support almost unanimously within the last quarter. Donations for Ron Paul coming, of course, mostly from U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, the top 3 employers of our donors. And those amounts totaling 6 times the amount donated to each of Ron Paul's Republican candidates combined, Ron Paul's Republican rivals combined, and 3 times that of the current President Barack Obama. So that's pretty impressive, and something important to remind people when they want to talk about Ron Paul's foreign policy, that if the men and women putting their lives in danger, they support Ron Paul overwhelmingly so. And then, of course, last night we had a rally in Hudsonville in the Grand Rapids area. Small business owners in Michigan on the front lines of commerce here, talking about, that Ron Paul is the one who's serious about freedom and jobs, serious enough to even talk about it in Michigan, where those issues can be sticky sometimes. And in the Republican Party, that is really the issue that separates the men from the old boys. The question of whether or not workers have the right to decide whether or not they want to join a union as a condition of employment. So that's a pretty important thing. I want to remind conservatives in Michigan about that one. Then earlier this afternoon, Ron Paul spoke in inner city Detroit, and I think Reverend Holly put it best when he said the reason for that being, why not Detroit? Why not? Why did Mitt Romney choose to have his thing at Ford Field? Why did we choose to have ours there? Because Ron Paul is the man of the people, and he's someone who can speak at ease in any setting at all, and that's something that not every Republican can actually do these days. The theme we're celebrating right here is pretty obvious. It's you guys. It's Youth for Ron Paul. How on earth do any Republicans in Michigan think they're going to beat Barack Obama without the support of you guys? How? How do they even imagine doing that? I can't even figure it out. And in all seriousness, since we're talking about you guys, what do you think Ron Paul's legacy is going to be? You think it's going to be putting an end to the Federal Reserve and the IRS?
Yeah.
Bring our troops home from all these unnecessary undeclared wars?
Yeah.
Well, this is a little difficult for me because I don't fully agree with that. Because he can't do any of those things by himself. Look around, you guys. You are Ron Paul's legacy, and it's what you do tonight and tomorrow that's going to affect the future of our country and whether or not we can do these things. So give yourselves a round of applause, and thank you all for coming tonight. State University. His name is Ethan Davis, and he led his group in collecting over 1,000 people requesting Dr. Paul come out tonight. That was a brilliant idea, and I hope we see that at more campuses across the country. Because guess what? Having those names on our list and being able to contact them and keep in touch with them and making sure that they know all the rules and the ins and outs of the election season as it goes in and out. That's very important. He did a great job out here, and I'm confident we'll do very well in the Lansing area, thanks to him. And so I'm proud to introduce the chair of Youth for Paul at MSU, Ethan Davis.
It was in 2007, when I was browsing YouTube, that I first heard about a hero. It was that day, it was from listening to him that day, that I opened my mind to politics and philosophy for the first time. It was then that I began watching the presidential debates just to hear this revolutionary man speak. It was then that my life changed forever. Such has been the case with many young people. It's often asked why it is that the youth love this man. Unlike our parents who get their news from television and newspapers, we're on the internet more, and with a broader variety of sources, we're more informed. We see right through the other candidates. We see this man's record. We see that while in Congress, he's never voted to raise taxes. He's never voted for an unbalanced budget. We see that he has sided with freedom every time on every issue. We see he's always stood up for the truth and even said the controversial courageously because he forms his beliefs based on principles which he doesn't sacrifice. We see that he's the only candidate who predicted the financial crisis. We see that what he's been saying for years and decades has always been true. We see his campaign pamphlets from 1988. We see that they look as if they'd been written yesterday because of his consistency, which speaks for his integrity. We see he has been married for over 55 years. Married 55 years, he has 19 grandchildren, 5 great-grandchildren. We see he's a family man with virtue and strong values. We see how he conducts himself in the debates. We see that although he's always been right, he is the most humble man in the race for the presidency. We see also that he is the only one who can win against Barack Obama for 3 reasons. Because he's the only one with appeal to the moderates and independents, he's the only one widely supported by our troops, and he's the only one with the army of young supporters needed to win. Finally, we see that he's an honest and trustworthy man, whose message of liberty is winning the hearts and minds of millions. It's my honor today to introduce this man who's changed my life. Please help me in welcoming him, Dr., Congressman, and Presidential Candidate Ron Paul.
Revolution has arrived to Michigan. I want to thank Ethan for giving me that nice introduction and for all his hard work for the students for Ron Paul, and I appreciate that very much. I appreciate the numbers that have come out. He said we could get a couple hundred. Yeah. Wow. I would like to introduce that young lady that I married 55 years ago, Carol. and one of our grandchildren with us, and this is Linda, the company's us. Thank you. Issue to talk about. It's not very complicated. I guess we could have a lot of words to describe what we're trying to do, but I settled for one word, and that is liberty. And if we come around to understand where liberty comes from and what the responsibility of government is, I think that will result in the best chance of having peace and prosperity throughout the world.
Yeah!
But our country today is no no longer the country it was a few years back or a few decades back. It certainly isn't the republic that was intended by the Constitution. We no longer have a republican form of government. And the founders were very adamant about it. They talked about a republic versus a pure democracy, and they had very bad feelings about a pure democracy where the 51% could gang up on the minority and dictate the rules of economics or the rules of personal behavior on the minority. And I'm afraid that's where we are today. But the spirit is alive. Let me tell you, in this country, more and more people now are waking up. The people like you are wide awake. You know what's wrong. You know what has to be done. Washington is sound asleep. What we need to do is make sure they hear us and make sure they know what the message is, and that is for liberty. Approximately 100 years ago, we embarked on a different direction. We virtually gave up on the Constitution, and it's been whittled away constantly ever since. And even in the last few years, it's gotten much worse. In spite of the people waking up and wanting something different, we still have a job cut out for ourselves, because Washington isn't hearing us, and they have not changed, but we will make a difference. We will make sure they hear this message. Especially under the Woodrow Wilson administration, things certainly started in the wrong direction. The foreign policy was changed, accepting this so-called idealism of making the world safe for democracy. And look at the last 100 years. It hasn't been very safe. A lot of people have died, and there's less freedom in the world today, and there's less freedom in this country. Also, a few other things occurred in 1913. A couple things that we should reverse. One, for instance, is the 16th Amendment. I'd like to reverse it. I'd like to repeal it. Truly the Jeffersonian approach to saying that our life and our liberty comes from our Creator, the consequence ought to be that the fruits of our labor ought to be our own and not the government's. But also there was one other item that they passed in 1913, and every once in a while I mention it. That was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. I'd like to repeal that as well.
And the Fed! 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 And the Fed!
Look at him smiling.
It will come. It will come. If we can't do it quickly, they'll do it to themselves. They'll self-destruct.
Yeah!
They have their anniversary coming up. It'll be 100 years old next year. So I think for the 100th anniversary, what we ought to do is repeal the Federal Reserve Act. That'd be interesting.
Yeah!
A lot of people ask me, why do you talk about this money system all the time and the Federal Reserve and concentrating on sound money and the Constitution? Isn't that so old-fashioned? Well, the founders knew something about this. They suffered through the inflation of the continental dollar. There was total destruction of the continental money, and therefore they didn't want it to happen to us. They wanted to protect it, so they put in the Constitution only gold and silver could be legal tender, and that you could not print paper money, and that you don't have authority to start a central bank. So we've sort of violated that a bit. They didn't amend the Constitution, they just totally ignore it. We now today have a unit of account called a Federal Reserve note, and they all sometimes refer to it as a dollar. But if you ask them, define a dollar, they have no idea how to define a dollar. They say, well, it means it's a Federal Reserve note. So they're trying to protect the value of something they don't even know what is, and they can't even define it. Then they wonder why they have a mess in Washington and around the world. The dollar and the money issue is so important because it's 1/2 of everything we transact, whether you're measuring wages or prices or incomes or interest rates. It's all measured by this dollar that you can't define, and then they wonder how we got into this mess. But the whole problem, starting in 1913, was to establish a growth path for big government. whether it was the income tax. Unfortunately, Jefferson lost the argument at the beginning of our country when he argued we shouldn't even be able to borrow, but we've been able to borrow all this time. So they also then said, well, taxes are limited because the people will rebel. The market limits borrowing because the interest rates will go too high. So that's why we had to have a central bank, because if we come up short, the federal government can always take their bills and their debt and send it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve just prints the money. It sounds good, sounds like a good thing, especially if it works, and it worked for a while. It works for a while until the country gets too much in debt. And even 20, 30 years ago, the debt wasn't that outrageous. But we were a creditor nation. We were on the positive side, even during the Depression. Today, we are the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. And they think the solution is spend more money and print more money. It's virtual insanity to think you can get out of trouble by doing the mistakes that have brought on the trouble. That's why we have to think about monetary policy, listen to the founders, and say, take away the power of the government and the Federal Reserve to create money out of thin air to finance wars. Certainly the money issue is a moral and a constitutional issue, but it's also very much of a government issue, government growth issue. Because it accommodates and it hides the bills for a while, governments can grow. So certainly, look at 1913 on. The entitlement system developed, the warmongering developed. Quickly after the Federal Reserve came into effect, they financed World War I. We had a depression in 1920-21. That depression lasted only 1 year because they weren't compelled by Keynesian economic theory to prolong the agony by propping up all the bad debt. There were no bailouts. So that depression ended a year. But by 1930, when the next depression came, Keynesian economics took over and said, they're too big to fail. We can't let them fail. We have to. We're good managers of the economy. Economic planning works, and we can get out of it. What did they do? They gave us a depression that lasted 17 years, and you'd think that would wake the people up, but it hasn't. They argued the case back then that the reason that we had a depression was because of the gold standard and also because of free markets. Well, that was absolutely wrong, but it was taught in our schools for decades and decades. But right now, the proof is out on the table that their policies have failed. The welfare state, the entitlement system, the inflation system, and the constant wars is a failed system, and it's ruining our country. We have to reverse that direction. Simple little thing that could have been done if we had only been able to send men and women to Washington that understood the Constitution and promised and lived up to their promise and obeyed the Constitution. We would not have the problems that we have today. Now, if that was the cause of our problem, why wouldn't the solution be make sure we send nobody to Washington, House, Senate, or the presidency that doesn't understand the Constitution, and you believe them when they make a promise that they will obey the Constitution? But over these many years, government has constantly grown, and therefore the attack on our personal liberties have been constant and steady. The economy now is in shambles because of constant debt, and there's no recognition that the correction for constant debt is liquidation of debt. Get rid of the debt. If you got into trouble and had too much debt, or your business had too much debt, you couldn't have economic growth if your credit ran out unless you got rid of your debt. You'd have to work harder and pay off your debt, get new jobs, or live more cautiously and live within your means. A country that lives over its means for a long time will be destined to live beneath its means, and that is what's happening right now. The country is poorer because everything is based on debt. And this is the reason the middle class is getting smaller, the middle class is getting poorer, and there's another characteristic of what happens when a country destroys its money and power gravitates into a central location like the federal government. The power then takes the value or takes the wealth of the middle class. It's automatically transferred to the wealthy. And this is what's been happening. During the bubble formation, Wall Street and the banks, they did quite well during the housing bubble. And then they got to gambling. They got to gambling with these derivatives, and they got themselves over their head. They went bankrupt. And then they come rushing for help to the government and the Federal Reserve and say that you got to bail us out. We're too big to fail. We're too big to fail. The whole economy is going to come down if you don't help us. So what did they do? The Congress and the Federal Reserve bailed them out. And what happened to the bad debt that should be liquidated? The bad debt was dumped on the people. That is what happened. And the very people that were supposed to be helped with these government programs and easy credit so everybody would have a house, guess what? They lost their jobs and they lost their houses and they're still suffering. Economic planning doesn't work unless it's done by the people, not by the government.
Yeah.